he bases the entire model on specifically Christianity. It's not even saying that Christianity are symbols that represent things. He puts Christianity at the centre of things, in terms of that Christ being born was a significant event. So the thesis, if you like, that he puts forward, in order to believe it, he has to be spot on about psychology, spot on about astrology, spot on about mythology, spot on about Christianity being the centre of things, and also spot on that paganism, which he describes as such, was brutal and evil and everything else. It's like, okay, is all of that correct?
No.
And therefore, that's the sniff test to ask yourself, to be like, wait a minute, no, that's not true. Hi again, everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of our slow march through Carl Jung's collected works, of course, the Bollingen series. In episode 1 of this series, which is linked in the video description down below, we went through from volume 1 to volume 9, part 1, Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. And today we're going to be finishing off that series by starting with volume 9, part 2, which is Aion, and going all the way through to... Will we be covering the Nietzsche seminars at all?
We could do a dream analysis one, or we could leave that to another time, I think, perhaps because Nietzsche's a topic all on his own, which is probably why he's in the seminar series. Yes,
two massive volumes, more than potentially all 3 of these on the table put together. Yeah. So the whole point of this series, of course, is just to give a brief overview of the different texts, as a general taste for yourself if you're looking to get into the works of Carl Jung or depth psychology as such. And of course, we're prepping for a very special project, which is Aion Revisited, 2 years after myself and Uber Boyo created that series, which became incredibly popular for seemingly no reason. I think it is time to revisit that. So to start things off then for today, I believe this one's Aion, isn't it?
Yeah, that's Aion.
It is. We're going into volume 9, part 2, my favourite book. I believe yours as well, Steve. I think you've told me that before. Your favourite book of all time. Aion. Aion is if you were a depth psychologist, a clinician, and you were going into the canon of Carl Jung, as we said about last time, you definitely go to volumes 1 and 2, and then there'd be a couple others within that you go to. In fact, those first 10 were pretty decent. But you'd never touch this, because it's clearly got no clinical value. And I think that's fair to say that everyone would agree on that, including people who really like the book, which included myself. So what is the point of it then? And then, of course, that's when you enter into a conversation about, well, what was Carl Jung? Was he a clinician? Was he a philosopher? Was he a man who has teachings? That's a phrase that's thrown around all the time. The teachings of Carl Jung. It's like he's extracted out of the depth psychology canon. I don't like that very much at all. And there's a few reasons why. You can break the book down into 3 parts. The first part is a model of the psyche, where he talks about the shadow, the ego, the anima, the animus, which he calls the syzygy in that, and, of course, the self. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's wrong, but it's obviously very outdated. It's from the 1950s. For example, Steve and Pauline, their model is, as you would have seen on the YouTube channel, much more updated. So if you're going to go read that first section, it's like, this is historical value, perhaps. The next section is all about a big like prophecy in the stars and how that links to human psychology and all these different apparent characters like Martin Luther and Saint Joachim and what's he called, Saint Benedict and all these other guys, and how they're linked in this big psychodrama about a clash between Christ and Satan, which is the clash between science and religion. And that's where you can really start using your own depth psychology skills to look at what Jung was really doing. Because, for example, there was a family legend in the Jung family where he believed he was descended from Goethe, and Faust Part 2 by Goethe was one of his favourite texts. And if you look at the struggle he believed he had inherited was the clash between science and religion. And so you look at this and suddenly the clash between science and religion is the big story that implicitly, if you read this, everyone should be concerned about. And that's, of course, how the book became popular, was Jordan Peterson saying this is a terrifying book. But reading it, it's like it's an apocalyptic film. It's like 2012 or something, which wasn't particularly good. This one could make for a more entertaining version of that. So it's got some entertainment value, I'd say. And the final section is just, I have no idea what to even make of it, to be honest. I don't know if you guys want to comment on the final section at all, but it's just very odd. He comes in and he links, seemingly kind of what you guys have actually been trying to do, is he's tried to link it to like science, basically, to say that, well, the self changes over time, like the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle, but it's nothing that would pass a scientific sniff test, ever. Same thing with his works on synchronicity. They've been debunked.
They have,
whereas,
unfortunately. Yeah.
Like, you wouldn't even need to debunk them in this necessarily. It's just, it's a metaphor, So, obviously, we're going to spend a lot of time going over this, but I'm wondering at like first glance what you two thought of Aion.
I think it would have been better if he hadn't uncoupled himself from Freud, actually.
Yeah. Yes, well, that's a really good point.
Actually makes a lot of sense.
Put a stick in the wheel, that has, hasn't it?
Well,
Sorry, Jung.
yeah. Well, he'd have probably had more of a scientific basis.
Yes, he
for
would.
A lot of his
He would.
ideas,
He would. Yeah.
As we're seeing now through, the study of neuropsychoanalysis.
Yeah,
it's
that's a really good.
There.
It's a really good point. Actually, it's quite left of field, but it's a really good point because Freud is currently being mapped into neuroscience, and successfully. That's a huge challenge for Jung, I'm afraid, and for people who follow Jung, to be able to replicate that. Because the suggestion is that Freud was right in so many ways that Carl Jung believed that he was wrong. With respect to the unconscious, how it works, where dreams come from, the mechanisms of repression, lots of the things that Carl Jung went on to reject completely and partially with respect, for example, to instincts. It appears now that this is being validated by neuroscience. In fact, it is being validated. So what remains really is to say, well, what parts of Jung can be incorporated within neuropsychoanalysis? That's happening now through the work of Mark Solms and, of course, the heritage of the late Jaak Panksepp. Our own point of view, though, we developed separately to Mark and his line. We were very much into clinical psychophysiology. That was our approach within a medical framework and looking at mind-body relationships. That does change everything with respect to how you model things like the shadow, the ego, the so-called syzygy, anima animus, and then the self as well. So if you look on Jung, as you were suggesting, I think, as more of a philosopher, well, okay, then there is some coherence in his model and his system, but if you try and map that into science, it falls apart. And as Pauline often observes, even if you don't do that, even if you just approach it as a psychotherapist, an applied real-world frontline clinician, most of Jung's ideas within themselves work very, very well. And then you have to move into the next idea, and that works very, very well. By the time you get to the third one, if you can follow me conceptually, you find that the first one doesn't work with the third one. What's going on? There is no through line that links in a sensible way. It really, Aion is a statement of his personal myth, as all of his collected works are. That brings with it its own problems because it is highly personal. And in order to immerse yourself into this in any meaningful way, you either have to be so like him you cannot be separated, or if you follow it completely, you have lost your identity completely. There is a third way, and that's the less pleasant way, and that is you have to be mentally ill yourself, I'm afraid. You have to be on the edge of falling victim to the kind of thing that Jung fought against his whole life in his own life. And at least for a substantial part of his life he tried to protect other people from, which is psychosis. And that is the shadow of Jung's theory, is that it's on the cusp of insanity in terms of how it models things and how it gets people to experience things. I know a lot of people won't like to hear this, but it's the truth. And you won't know unless you can stand outside of your own context. That's another problem of works like this, is that they are inflationary. They will puff you up massively with ideas that are not personal. And Jung has advised against this, cautioned against it significantly. If you identify with this kind of material personally, you will lose it. He knew that. And psychiatric units are full of people who use this kind of imagery and explicate these kind of motifs in their daily life as if they were real in an absolute sense. And they end up, sadly, being incarcerated. Some of them getting electroshock, electroconvulsive therapy, or put on SSRIs forever, or whatever it might be. So in that sense, it's dangerous material. The best way to approach this is to see it as the product of Jung's personal journey and as part of his ongoing attempt to maintain the stability in his own personality within the context of his parents and the influences that were on him. As James was saying, it's more a case for him of trying to reconcile irreconcilable things in his background, religion and science. And the religion definitely comes from his own father complex and things that happened to him at the hands of a Jesuit priest, which fairly common knowledge about the fact that he was sexually abused as a child. and the effects on him of that. So be very careful following this. It's not a terrifying book.
Not at
No,
all.
it's not
At all. In fact, Paul and I have never approached it in that way. When we encountered it, it was interesting because it was new and it was a different angle. But having navigated through it nearly 40 years ago, fully, I came out the other side realising that that was so highly personal and had so little relevance for the vast majority of people.
Yeah.
That it was nothing more than a curiosity within his own personality. The Christian iconography, for example, will mean next to nothing to a Hindu.
I'm going to point that out as well, because he bases the entire model on specifically Christianity. It's not even saying that Christianity are symbols that represent things. He puts Christianity at the centre of things, in terms of that Christ being born was a significant event. So the thesis, if you like, that he puts forward, in order to believe it, he has to be spot on about psychology, spot on about astrology, spot on about mythology, spot on about Christianity being the centre of things, and also spot on that paganism, which he describes as such, was brutal and evil and everything else. It's like, okay, is all of that correct?
No.
And therefore, that's the sniff test to ask yourself, to be like, wait a minute. No, that's not true. So, but with Aion, because it's so tightly wrapped up together with all those different parts, if you reject one of them, the whole thing crumbles. Yeah. That doesn't by default mean there's nothing of value. That's a personal choice, but it does mean that the thing falls apart very easily if you're not Carl Jung.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, this is him trying to keep his stuff together.
Yes, it is.
Really.
It
and
is.
we were saying yesterday, because we were talking about the Alexander the Great video that's just gone out, and about the hand that he was dealt as an individual, his parents, essentially. And we were sort of saying, well, you know, how did he go on to do what he did and to keep it all together? Well, this idea that his mother told him that his father was really Zeus creates a kind of a superordinate being onto which to project your ego.
That's a really good
and
point.
And you see this with people who are going through psychosis, which is why very often they have religious delusions and hallucinations. And you also see it with things like psychopathy as well, where suddenly someone will become a born-again Christian, for example, and it's just a way of trying to hold it all together. And I think you see a similar thing here with Jung as well in his life.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Absolutely agree with that. Yeah, with psychopaths, they need a bigger bully than they are, and they can't imagine what that possibly could be unless it was some supraordinate deity. So you very often find that they head towards, I'll say, a monotheistic religion. There's a smorgasbord of options there. But those who take on a born-again Christian role, for example, a really powerful evangelical role, the psychopathy is still present.
Yes.
And you can see it, and you can experience it, you can feel it. It's an energy around them. But they generate the projection, if you like, of this bigger bully than they are in order to attempt to control themselves.
Yes, create stability,
It creates stability. And when people are fracturing into a psychosis, and Jung observed this himself at the Bergholzli, they will attempt to knit that back together again by having a systematized structure. Yeah. And a monotheistic idea is a really good way of doing that.
It is.
Because you're not dealing then with apparently desiccated complexes, you're dealing with one organising system. So it makes sense. If, for example, you followed a polytheistic tradition, say like the Greco-Roman gods, and you were psychotic, it would be harder for you to knit yourself together using that framework. There would be a tendency to fracture down into, even if it was only the 12 fundamental gods of Olympus, for example. Never mind all of the different variants on that as you descend down through the more minor deities. But a monotheistic tradition would allow someone to contain themselves until it then split into its dark and its light poles, and you start to bring in the idea of Satan, i.e. Jung's shadow, and then you have to deal with the idea that the feminine in nature has been split off as well. So Jung gets into Gnosticism because that was the way of recovering the feminine elements, and you can see that his attempt to knit this all together was more to do with him than anything else. And that's another really hard red pill to swallow, but that's pretty much the truth of it. So there are a lot of problems with Aion, a lot of problems with them, and if you go into that with the wrong perspective, you run the risk, if you have any fracture lines in yourself, of going a bit strange yourself. I'm
Yes.
afraid that's just the way that it is in the real world. And please bear in mind that my perspective on this is clinical. It has nothing to do with philosophy. It has nothing to do with the need to identify with Carl Jung or anybody else in order to give me a projected self-image to contain my own issues. I've been through that phase. I don't need him anymore, I'm afraid, as an image to project onto. People do, and this is why they project onto manner personalities on the internet.
I think also, Steve, come back to your clinical point. I mean, Jung's theory as a whole kicks in at midlife.
Yes, it does.
And if you're a working clinician, not everyone who comes through the door comes through at midlife.
No.
You get people of all ages.
Yeah.
And you know, you have to be able to adapt and deal with that. So it runs short.
This is really,
in that regard as well.
Really good point, and this is going to sound harsh again, but Jung was interested in Jung. That was it, and that's really why when he started to fundamentally tackle himself, he was approaching midlife, and therefore all that he produced around that time had to do with that stage of adaptation. Whereas at least with some of the other theorists, people like Adler, who was into social interest and overcoming feelings of inferiority, or Freud, who had to do basically with instincts and adaptation in early life, you can see it's more applicable for what most people go through before they settle into a groove. So for young people to be into Jung is a mistake. And this is why we said earlier that you really do need to go through Freud and Adler first before you can legitimately take on the more adapted and better sides of Jung's work. But they are not to be found in this. Even his description of the personality at the beginning is an attempt to justify why the middle part of that book has been written. It gives it a dignity, apparently on the surface, but it's not there, I'm afraid. And his concept of the self is a psychologism. It's a reduction of a phenomenon which is far bigger than psychology and not necessarily anything spiritual. So I would ask people listening to set that aside for a moment and just look at the fundamentals, become based and have a look at this. What's Jung talking about? He's talking about an inherited regulating structure which he psychologizes as an image which he calls the self, which really can only be the genome. It can't be anything else. And what you experience as the self psychologically, in Jung's own terms, is therefore a projection from the genome as a compressed file, if you like, or an image which consciousness can have some chance of understanding. So if you believe that God and Jung's model of the self, and he does switch on this. Some people say, no, he never said that. Well, he does. He's quite clear that for him there is some crossover point between the idea of the self and a monotheistic God. You are beginning to lose your grip at that point in terms of the real world. Have whatever fantasies you like, but you're at risk of losing it. Okay, volume 10, Civilization and Transition. I would say this is one of the most significant volumes in Jung's collected works, far more important than this, far more grounded, even though, and this will appear to be a contradiction, that he does go on about the self, of course, in The Undiscovered Self, which is one of his most famous works, and that is in this book. Also, UFOs, flying saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies. Now, they're the popular ones. Out of those two, I would equally weight them as being of significance in in-depth psychology. The Undiscovered Self, despite what I said earlier, just to qualify about the self and his view on it, at a psychological level, it's a very significant and important work. His idea on UFOs as well, at the time, given what was known, was logical, it was rational, it was deeply intelligent, and again, a very informed work. But they're not the most important works in here, I would suggest. I would look at his essays on contemporary events, bearing in mind that addressed the issue of the collective psyche during the war, or the interwar period, the rise of the Nazis and Hitler. But even more than that, I would go right back to the essay Mind and Earth. And the reason that I would do that is because I have seen people transformed by that idea. That notion of a connectivity to the land, and where he says that the land itself has a psyche, the places have, you could call it a numinosity, but there's also a presence of mind which is ancestral, that has something to do with the way that the land is shaped. whether there's running water through there, whether there's natural rocks, what the trees are like, and how that kind of thing has always attracted people. So you get this numinosum emerging from the landscape. His understanding of that I found in my own clinical work to be important, to have great relevance, because people do get such things as sick building syndrome. They live in overcrowded populations with sterile concrete environments. They yearn for a tree. And in China, for example, their view on trees is very, very different. They literally believe that the trees are breathing, and they breathe and respirate with what they call qi, or ki, energy, vital energy. And of course there's some basis to that, but it's the psychological feeling a place can have. And we know of places that we can go to, don't we, love, where the character of the layout of the land and the shape of trees instantly changes your mind. Instantly. It brings about an emotional change. Emotion is limbic system and brainstem. It's deep down into instinct. Instinct is the connection between mind and earth. So that is a hugely significant essay within this volume, and the volume itself, I would say, is massively more significant than this, which is an aberration, a personal aberration of Jung's. This is a divergence for his own reasons. This is more relevant for people, and it was very, very relevant for the politics of his day as well. So yeah, Volume 10, Civilization and Transition, I would highly recommend it.
Is that the one with Wotan in it? Was
yes, Wotan is
Wotan,
in it.
Yeah, because Wotan's also very, very good. We had a conversation about Wotan, one of our very first phone conversations we had. I remember that distinctly, because you mentioned Aion, I mentioned Aion, then you're like, read Wotan instead. I was like, there's good stuff in there, which is also very applicable to today as well. But
it is.
Should probably keep quiet on that.
Yeah, I would agree, and thank you for putting that little caveat in, because it would be very easy to wander off into the depth psychology of contemporary events, our contemporary events, the times in which we live. And Wotan is here, you could say, in that Jungian archetypal sense. Wotan is present in a form that he, in inverted commas, has not appeared in before. In fact, you may say that his gender is different, but he's present. And that process of deconstruction and destruction that Jung suggested was in the imago of Wotan within the Germanic psyche. And Germanic includes any Germanic people, so
Anglo-Saxon.
the Anglo-Saxons. It includes the Franks in France. Includes people in Belgium, in the Benelux countries, in Scandinavian countries, all broadly Germanic, right down into Switzerland itself, and even the north of Italy. The presence of Wotan in it, I will say, its non-gendered form in our culture at the moment is very real, and it's a danger. It really is. As Jung himself said, Wotan would just disappear off into the Black Forest and await his moment. And when he emerges, he may not be a he. He didn't say that, but that's something to consider. Okay, Volume 11, Psychology and Religion, West and East. This is normally picked up by people in the form of either two separate volumes or even separate essays within it. I learned the most from the East rather than the West with respect to this. Although under Psychology and Religion in the West, he did address something which was very important in his day, and even in our day, as we were going through this transition in terms of culture. And that specific essay was Psychotherapists or the Clergy. So the role of psychotherapists in his day was moving more towards the kind of role that had been occupied by Christian priests for some period of time. The issue of the confessional, confidentiality, and deep spiritual aspects of work. So I always found that to be useful, and I've worked with Christian priests and ministers at various ranks, also those from other faiths as well, some monotheistic and some not, and they took it to be an experience within the framework of their own religion, and that particular essay did help me to understand what my proper role would be when working with people of faith at that level, and particularly where they'd lost their faith, as a number of them had done in the face of awful events in life and challenges. So yeah, that one that particular essay I find useful. Answer to Job, yeah, that's interesting. If you're a theologian, you could spend some time articulating yourself around that if you wish. Yes, of course, I studied it, and I found it interesting at a philosophical level, but again, when it came to dealing with the fundamentals of it, it was of no use at all clinically, absolutely none. Even in relation to the notion of the shadow and how that shadow is configured, because if you get too philosophical about that idea, you can start to mix and match things up. It's a difficult thing to explain without a clinical example, but suffice to say that for me, philosophically, okay, fine, it's a curio, and it has relevance for people who are struggling with Christianity or transitioning away from that as the background culture changes. But within its own context, again, it was just really part of Jung's ongoing work as he pushed himself through the debris of his father complex. That's how I interpret it. When it comes to psychology and the East, then that was of huge significance to me because of I kind of emerged out of the back end of the hippie. That sounds awful. The back end of my mother was not a hippie. I kind of emerged out the back end of the hippie era, didn't we, dear? And in
Don't involve me in this.
And
Keep
in that
digging the hole.
Okay. I wonder where I'll end up. It might be one of those unfortunate places that the Christians go on about. But anyway, as I was saying, what was I saying? Oh yes, it was huge significance to me because I was around at the time the hippies were around, and they were exploring Eastern traditions, and I was exposed very intimately to deep structured Chinese culture. Their shamanism, as well as just Buddhism and Taoism on the surface, there is a shamanism in China which is very, very powerful, and also the links between that and Tantric Buddhism, which itself is rooted in Hinduism and Bonpo shamanism in Tibet. All of these things syncretized, you get at the deep structures of Chinese culture. And Chinese culture in the city of Liverpool in the UK, which was and is still the oldest Chinatown in Europe, was very deeply embedded, and I was given exclusive access at a very young age to that, and went through all sorts of initiation ceremonies and following various practices and traditions. So when I was going through that, and then I encountered Jung, bearing in mind I'd been studying Freud first, and I encountered Jung initially through his forward to the I Ching, the Richard Wilhelm translation. That was a thunderbolt of a strike for me, because I realised, or it seemed to me, here was someone who understood the Eastern mind from the perspective of the West, but in a way which could only, in my learning at that time and even since, be properly appreciated by seeing Jung as a figure who properly belonged in the Hellenistic age, even more than, say, the Renaissance. Because Hellenism, the age that followed Alexander, was all about the syncretism of ideas and between cultures. And that Jung understood that the proper bridge to China was India. India, for a European, you have to go through India to understand China. And when I read that in not just the I Ching, but forward to the Richard Wilhelm translation, but his other works on the Eastern traditions, that gave me a place to stand, which was vitally important, so I could remain who I was, which, despite the depth of induction into Chinese mysticism and shamanism, was nevertheless a Westerner who has, as I would have described myself rather boldly, as someone who has a Celtic soul but a soaring Greek spirit. That blend of my bloodline ancestry, but the aspiration which came from classical Greek culture, and particularly the Hellenistic age, as ushered in by Alexander and his successors. So that gave me appreciation for India, which I'd skipped. I'd gone straight to China, which was a mistake. And Jung was able to point that out for me. Also his essay, Yoga in the West. So much yoga around in the 60s and the 70s. And there still is. There are people who think that they understand that, separated out, distilled from its culture, without an understanding of that distillation process. It doesn't work. And again, Jung's wisdom in understanding that was so important to me. And again, and clinically, I was able to help so many poor Westerners, if you like, I mean poor in the sense of the disadvantaged experience, shall we say, who'd gone through supposed yoga training and various, you could call them Buddhistic cults and the like, and had really severely disturbed themselves because they had lost the ground upon which they should have stood. And this goes back to mind and earth in civilization and transition, and the deep connection to the ancestral soil. And the fact that the soil itself is soaked with the blood of generations of your ancestors. And this is not to be racist. This is to talk about a simple fact that you can feel this in some places and in other places you can't. And it's not just a place. The place becomes something which is extended out and becomes part of the psyche, part of your ancestral memory and of your ancestral psyche as well. This is the proper playground, if you like, for Jungian archetypes, where archetypes properly are whole contexts. They're not individual abstracted characters. Forget that. You'll get nowhere if you do that. You have to experience something through emotion, through affect, through engagement. That involves the context, which is the land. So Jung's understanding of that really helped me understand that my connection to the Chinese, however deep, would only ever be provisional. I could keep digging into that forever, and I did, pretty much, for all of my youth and way into middle age. I still have connections there, but I know that it's not 100% authentic, and it never can be for that reason. The solution is the transcendent position that you get from a Hellenistic approach, but to do that you have to appreciate India, the subcontinent of India, Hinduism. If you can understand that, you'll understand many, many things. You'll even understand Christianity better, and that might be a bit of a blow to some Christians, or something they would rather not look at, but India is fundamental. Hinduism as it exists now is probably the oldest continuous mainstream religion, unaltered. Although it does evolve, the fundamentals of it have not altered. It's a very, very old faith. And it's a paradox because it's both a monotheism and a polytheism simultaneously, but they manage to blend that properly. And on one side of India and its influences there is China, on the other side there's the Middle East and Europe, and through the Middle East came Greek culture through Alexander and his successors, and they formed a very, very powerful bridge. Jung understood this, and you can probably tell from the way I'm speaking that I'm still influenced heavily by Jung in that way. So if you want to understand the East as a Westerner, follow the guidance in Jung's writings and go to China via India. Or if you come back to the West, once you've gone there and found not what you had sought, to quote Seven Sermons of the Dead, or to paraphrase it, which I have here, of course. 7 Sermons to the Dead.
Come back from Jerusalem.
Yes, come back from Jerusalem. If you come back from China having found not what you had sought, then pause a while on your journey in India. You will learn a great deal. And one of the things that you'll find are the fundamental footprints of your own culture and your own civilization. And those footprints are Greek. The foundations are Greek. And you'll also see the influence on Buddhism from Hellenism. You'll find statues of Buddha wearing Greek togas. You'll find carvings of Buddha with a European face, and you'll find Greek heroes like Heracles, and even Alexander himself as being incorporated into Buddhism as guardians of Buddhism, or Alexander being equated with the Hindu deity Indra, he who bore the thunderbolt, which is the Vajra as it's known in Tantric Buddhism. There's so much depth in that, but you will, as I say, paradoxically get a view on your own culture in the West, which has been so overridden since the end of the classical and Hellenistic ages, which incidentally coincides with the rise of Christianity. That's another story. In my view, and this is personal, Jung never freed himself from Christianity. He struggled with it his whole life, and he was never able to fully free himself. His dalliances in the East were an attempt to balance it. It didn't fully work. That's why we have Aion, which is his attempt to square himself with himself. But fundamentally, his religious attitude came from his father, and that's not been adequately explored. It should be. Otherwise, you run the risk of being absorbed into Jung's own myth, and you'll lose your own.
Just following on from what you said, Steve, which is really emphasising the value of culture.
Yeah.
From a clinical point of view, there is such a thing as cultural psychosis.
Yes.
I mean, I've worked with patients who
Yes, you
have
have.
cultural psychosis, and I think you probably have experience of it
Not
yourself
as much
too.
as you, but I do know about
But when you see that, when you see somebody who's been abstracted out from their own culture, from their own soil, literally, and transplanted into another land, another culture, they can and do become mentally ill.
They do, absolutely. And I've worked with converts, and I'm not going to say between which religions, but I've worked with several, and that can cause problems, psychological problems, which they can't face because the religion that now contains them will not allow them to do it. So you get an immediate division. One fellow I can think of, and I won't mention names, or indeed the religions involved, was haunted by a dream where the back door of his house was kicked in by this huge, he said, monstrous figure that had green leaves shooting out of his mouth and growing out of his hair and out of his arms. And he was raging in the back of the house, and he hid cowering in the front of the house. And I had to handle that very, very sensitively. It's obviously what would be called a pagan image. I would know it as the Green Man. I would know it as Viridius, Deo Viridius, as he was known to the Romans. That figure also turns up in Islam. It's a common feature you see in European churches, medieval churches. It's part of the Gawain and the Green Knight story as well. But this guy had no conscious connection to us at all. But suffice to say that the context of his life and his conversion between different religions meant that he had constellated that force. And it literally came in through the back door, and you can take that metaphorically as being his unconscious mind, whilst he cowered consciously in the front room, the conscious part of his personality, unable to integrate that which was calling upon him to do so. So, and this goes back to psychotherapists or the clergy. You will, if you work in depth, find yourself in that role, and it can be a tricky one because what religious attitude do you take? I try to take a naturalistic one in the sense that there's an adaptation to the person who's present that allows you to be with them in a humanistic sense, and not, as far as is possible, to be turned into whatever demonology that particular faith wants to project onto you. And they do, as James was saying a while ago off camera, and Pauline actually, that one of the problems with monotheism is how do you deal with evil and how do you integrate it. And this, of course, is Job and all the other works that Jung was into with respect to Christianity and solving that problem. You could say that psychologically, in a real sense, that the minute you try to be too light, as Jung said, you cast a dark shadow. So a one-sided monotheism will necessarily generate its opposite, and it tends to be monotheisms that produce the greatest polarity. They produce the greatest personification of evil, simply because they're trying to be one-sided.
This is why, for people who've seen the Aion series, Jung brings in Satan, or the Antichrist, as the equal and opposite to Christ. He actually has to bring Satan up more than he's normally talked about to cope with it, and it's that idea of opposites again.
It's what you see clinically too, isn't it?
It's what you see clinically when people are that divided, and if they've been shaped by a particular religious belief, you get a massive amount of neurotic suffering on the way to becoming psychotic, because it's prefigured. The division is already there because of their belief, and that division becomes a very wide fracture line. If you imagine a plate that's cracked from rim to centre, it doesn't take much weight bearing before it breaks completely, and the psychological plate of the personality of people who are too much into opposites, that fracture line is really wide, and it doesn't take much to crack them. Whereas if you get people who are religious in that conventional sense and who are polytheistic, they have a very neat trick available to them which monotheists don't, and that is that you can manoeuvre around your favour and your interaction between different deities and play one off against the other whilst you work on yourself on the inside and get them in balance. that's an effective homeostatic system, which means that a lot of polytheistic faiths have survived despite the very aggressive, which tends to come with monotheism, by the way, like you are different from us, therefore we will not like you and project darkness onto you. You tend not to get that of polytheists. They tend to be more open about other faiths and look for ways for connecting things. But the big advantage they've got is that they are not so prone to dividing under pressure of their own beliefs, to splitting completely into two opposite halves. They can always have this rationalistic discourse with their individual deities and avatars and however else that they configure them in order to keep themselves in balance.
Can I ask a question on when you're saying earlier about the land?
Yes.
And you mentioned like races and things like that. I was thinking about Americans.
Yeah.
Because Americans have only really been over in America as the European settlers for 400 or 500 years.
Yeah.
You're talking about how important it is for the land. Do you reckon Americans would, as broadly, feel more at home or have that same connection you were saying to the old world than to the new world? Or do you think enough time has passed so that America is now the deep homeland?
Well, that's a good point. I know a lot of American tourists, when they come here, are stunned by the emotion that they feel going around historical places in Britain. And you can take that as being on the surface because they're looking at Windsor Castle and the things that they rejected, like royalty. But that surface structure, deep structure, there is a meaning to the idea of royalty. And there's a meaning to the idea of the sovereignty of the land, which was the marriage between the king, the monarch, the queen, whichever, and the land. It's the fertility of the land. Our present queen in the UK, by archaic rite, that is R-I-T-E, should be the monarch of the land and the mediator between the people and the land. She should embody sovereignty. Sovereignty is a goddess, it's a Celtic goddess. And of course you could ask, does our present monarch embody sovereignty in that sense? Is she the mediator between the people and the land? Is she accountable to the people for the failure of the land, of the crops, of its fecundity, of the people's fertility? Is she? Or is she a surface structure which has been politically set up and managed that way? I would say probably the latter.
Yeah, definitely.
But to hopefully answer James's question, there has been a passage of time, enough for a cultural myth to emerge in the US, for them to feel connected to the land. But there's also this sense, isn't there, of guilt that they took that land off the Native Americans, and they're in process of balancing that. And one of the ways of balancing it is to throw sand in the air. Believe it or not, this is particularly what intuitives will do, and there's a lot of intuitives in America. So if they see themselves as an immigrant nation, then one way to keep that fresh and distracted is to have more immigration, more and more turnover. It's a little bit like the Maoist idea of continuous revolution. What the Chinese Communist Party of that day, I'm not saying anything about this day, tried to do to keep themselves in a state of control was to generate the impression of change. Now that's a dynamic. It's not the same, but it's a dynamic. Now you move the general idea of that dynamic into American culture and how they continually reinvent themselves through a turnover of population. You can see how they continually generate that myth. It also allows them to eradicate the conscience of the past for taking the land off the Native American people, because there's more and more people from different nations coming in. And the founding culture, which was European, primarily British, is being progressively eradicated as well. That's the process of keeping the thing dynamic. So it's a homeostatic mechanism, if you like, that allows that culture to keep itself going under the impetus that it's been going under, I would say. Okay, guys, here we have a trio of books on alchemy, basically. They're not Jung's only writings on alchemy, but they form the main corpus of it. You can connect this to Aion, and you can connect it to some of his later works as well, particularly volume 16, which I have a huge regard for, by the way. But in regard to this is a continuation of Jung's personal myth. I'm going to keep this really brief. Essentially, he said that the alchemists projected the psyche into matter, and that was what it was. They were philosophers, philosophical alchemists. They weren't the pseudo-chemists, the puffers, as he called them. But there is a shadow side to Jung's exposition on that, and that is that he projected his psychology into philosophical alchemy. He was doing what they were doing. There's no need for this. None. Absolutely none in terms of application in the real world. None of this is necessary. You can indulge in it, you can read it, you can study it, you can do all of that, and in terms of moving on, you will not have done. You'll be in a state of inertia, stasis. It will not move you on. It will just distract you. It will use up your processing power. It's not worth it. But if you want to follow it as a philosophical route, if you want to have the imitatio Jungi, if you like, rather than the imitatio Christi, then follow that by all means. But personally, as a clinician, and remember my perspective is as a clinician, none of this is necessary. None of it at all. And that's really all I want to say on it.
I can see immediately what some people will be thinking to throw at you in the comments section, which should be, do not think Jung knew what he was doing in terms of him projecting his own psychology.
Yes, he did know, he did, and he made it very, very clear, and it's astonishing really that the people don't pick up on that. Thanks for bringing that up, James. That throughout his works he makes it absolutely clear that this is highly personal and it all has to do with him. What's up with people who can't see that? Well, it's quite simple. They are projecting into this, and they're transferring certain things across, which is issues with their own religion, issues with their own sense of meaning or lack of meaning and purpose, and that these then become reified, even deified, to the extent that they take on a magical element. Well, if you want to waste your time with that, great, good luck. People like me, and some people not like me, will be waiting for you in a psychiatric unit.
Might be worthwhile as well mentioning that there is that other volume that was published before these on alchemy. There's the psychology of alchemy.
Yes, yeah. So there's that, and of course there's many other things. But on the subject of alchemy, now that you've said that,
that's the one. Is that the one?
This is the one. Yes. I don't know if this is Ethan Allen Hitchcock, an American. I wonder if it is possible to zoom in onto that, please, Jane. This was an American general, American Civil War general, who wrote this book, Alchemy and the Alchemists, before Jung was born. And in it, he suggests that alchemy is a form of psychology and philosophy, and should be looked at in that way. This guy was a precursor to Carl Jung. He's virtually unknown. But in many ways, he's more balanced, because he doesn't project himself into it. It's an objective study of alchemy, years before Carl Jung was even born, and obviously years before he'd ever even heard of alchemy. So Jung is not the only person who has worked with alchemy as a philosophy within the relatively recent past. So yeah, think about that. Have a think about the significance of that. So for me anyway, that's all I'd want to say on those. No clinical value whatsoever, but volume 16, which includes alchemy, does have significance because it's applied properly. Okay, volume 15, The Spirit in Man, Art and Literature. A very slender volume, interesting though in parts. There's the beginning of it's about Paracelsus. I'll leave that because that really belongs with alchemy and other such things. But there's also an examination of Ulysses by Joyce, James Joyce, which I think was one of his better attempts at analysing someone in a formal sense. I was asked about that actually, but wasn't I on a radio interview?
Yes.
Somebody tried to catch me out and said, well, have you read Ulysses? I said, no, I've read Carl Gustav Jung's analysis of it. Yes, yeah. Which floored her a little bit, I think. But yeah, this is useful. It's a slim volume, something of a curiosity in some sense. There are essays in there that don't really fit anywhere else. But in that sense, yeah, good. Interesting. Now, moving on, this is one of my favourites. This is the Practice of Psychotherapy, volume 16. And in that you have a presentation of the Rosarium Philosophorum, which of course is alchemical, the woodcuts, as a process of allegorising the transference relationship in psychotherapy. This alone This alone could have several hours dedicated just to a description of that process. But if you want to understand alchemy in the real sense of application to people and to relationships, then this is the place to start without a shadow of a doubt. And I recommend on the Discord that people don't go near Aion, but if they are serious, don't go near Aion. If they are serious about understanding psychological therapy, depth psychology in a Jungian sense, jump in on this one. But you do have to be serious. You have to want to go into an objective analysis of yourself or the relationship that you're in, or working with other people. This, if you follow it, will challenge you. It's not an abstraction. This becomes real at this point, because it's about the energy exchange and information between you and another person, superficially, but also through the unconscious. And I think it's an excellent piece of work, much overlooked, and it shouldn't be. So I don't know how you guys feel, but that would be how I would introduce that in terms of its value. And it's worth clinically.
The model with the Rosarian, I think, is potentially overly complicated if you were going to say give a lecture on the transference.
Yeah.
But from everyone I've spoken to about it, which is in the tens of people, you know, a lot of people, they get it. It's a useful model for getting it. So I agree. But that part of it's only about half the book or something, isn't it?
It is. There's a lot in there about psychotherapy generally, and all of it is of value. If I had to get rid of every one of those books on the shelf there in the collected works, but only keep one, it would be this one, and that's a clinician's perspective.
Even more so than 1 and 2.
Yes, I would actually, because I'm quite content with 1 and 2 because it's just routine. You know, the psychiatric studies and experimental researchers working with complexes. Yeah, that's absolutely fine, no problem. But this is different. This gives you an opportunity to have a different dimension, if you like, to your work, without being lost in overly abstracted and overly reified personal contents from Jung's process of working himself through. And of course there's Coming Together, Coming Apart, which is based on volume 16.
Yes,
got that
did you? It might be behind.
Yeah, I think it's pertinent to bring this book in at this point, although it's not actually Jung's.
It's much more simplified than that one as well.
Yes.
Much more simplified,
Yes. Yeah.
But this and the Rosarium in here is the justification for this work by John Destian. Now, John Destian, Jungian analyst, he was also a divorce lawyer, and he managed to bring both of those disciplines together, the experience from the one feeding into the experience of the other. He does simplify this, but it is built upon this, particularly the Rosarium element within it. So, in that sense, I would say volume 16 is absolutely necessary if you're going to practice as a clinician. And remember, that's my context. I'm not talking about a philosopher. Not talking about someone who wants to improve themselves generally through education in a wider sense. I'm not talking about someone who wants to follow a cult, whether that's a present-day manner personality on the internet, or somebody from the past, a deceased personality who is revivified and projected out there as some kind of supraordinate ego for people to identify with. This is a clinician's perspective. Yeah. If you have another perspective, that's fine and it's valid, but that's mine. And that's the one I'm making. That's the case I'm making today.
Well, application is everything, isn't it? And like you say, it's what makes John Destian's book so attractive, really, is his experience in the divorce courts and seeing in the raw how acrimonious things get in relationships, but nonetheless taking something of value out of that, which is that it's just another expression of passion, of animation, really, that people have for one another, or being, it's a transition from love into hate. But the value of this is that you can reverse that equation as well. And clearly that's invaluable when you're working with couples who are at war with one another, and also giving them the hope that they're not actually at the end of a process, but they're actually at the beginning of a journey. And that they can transform what was negative back into something that's positive again. And that's immensely helpful in healing that message.
It is, and he puts that together well.
He puts it together extremely well. Yeah.
Pauline and I have used that as a set book for training courses. Also, we've used it as a prescription for couples who are in trouble. But the foundation of this book is this book.
Yes.
And again, this is a real world clinician's perspective on things.
So about 17.
Yeah, development of personality. Interesting. It's a relatively slim volume, and much of Jung's work regarding children is in here. And if you compare that to the vast amount of work that he wrote in his collected works, you can see there's not much attention on children. And traditionally, it's been said that Jung regarded Freud as having done all of that work, and that he wasn't going to bother with it. So just look at that. You know, there's some truth in that, but there are some very useful things in here. I think it's in here we've got Marriage as a Psychological Relationship, which is a foundation text for Joe and Jane Wheelwright. Joe Wheelwright, who created one of the first, in fact the first, structured Jungian personality test, the Gray-Wheelwright test. It's a foundational text for that. But there's also things which challenge anybody, such as who teaches the teachers and the importance of education. We are suffering at the moment from this like probably never before in the West, because so many of our freedoms have been eroded and so many things are being pushed into the minds of children by teachers, many of whom shouldn't be teachers.
Agreed.
And so when he asks that question, who teaches the teachers, who educates the educators, that provides a context. And in our clinical work, one of the first things we always want to assess when we meet somebody is who is influencing this person, who has influenced them. That provides the wider background to show what the energy flow, the informational flow, the significant impressions on the formation of that person's character have been and are currently being. And it's the same, therefore, with teachers. What kind of mind do they bring? Jung talks about psychological hygiene, and he's absolutely right. Pauline took this to heart years ago, didn't you? This idea of where Jung says a physician, a surgeon must have clean hands. Well, what's the state of the mind of the therapist? What's the state of the mind of the teacher? You know, on impressionable young minds.
Yes, what brings you into teaching, for example. And sometimes with some people we have gone as far as to say that you know, if you desperately want, for example, to work with children, then maybe that should actually exclude you from working with them because of the degree to which your libido is invested in working with them. And unfortunately, you know, we kind of slip into things such as paedophilia and the like.
It's real.
But it is real. That's not to say that, you know, you can't have an interest in children and work with them, but it's a matter of degree, isn't it?
It is.
And you do find this, unfortunately, sometimes. This is how these people slip through the net.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, you always find them where their victims are. Always.
Yeah.
You could say a baseline test which you kick against in order to abstract the people who should work with children could be along the lines that you've just said, that anyone who wants to work with a child shouldn't. You have to be able to refute that and say that you do for whatever reason and prove it, and not just say, well, I like children. Well, actually liking children might be contraindicated because you might like them too much.
Yeah, that's right.
So how do you distill that out? How do you find the character of those who educate children and change their minds, shape their minds? It's particularly relevant at the moment. No need to go into that. I'm sure everybody's aware of what's going on in our schools.
Yep.
But that's highly important. So although it's a slim volume and he doesn't have much to say directly on children, what he does say is valuable. In that sense, that is a valuable volume. Of these three, and in fact of all of Jung's collected works, this is my favourite in terms of it being practical. It's something to return to. It's evergreen, I would suggest. So the last three we'll look at for today. The Zofingia Lectures, which is a supplementary volume. This should be of interest to genuine scholars of Jung who want to get an appreciation of his mindset before he qualified in medicine. What you'll see from here is a very intelligent, very articulate, very well read already young man who was asserting himself in an Adlerian sense with his peers at university. The questions he was asking were very challenging and had to do with creating a space for himself before he developed his own model. And yet you can also see within that the seeds of his own fractal lines, which turned up later in 1913 post the break with Sigmund Freud, that then led to his so-called creative illness, that could also be considered to be an ongoing issue of psychotic illness and stability that perhaps lasted for the rest of his life. But it was prefigured, and as we were saying earlier with some of the earlier volumes, you can see some of that here. So intelligence is not necessarily a defence against psychosis. It can strike anybody. There are other examples, of course, that we could quote. So yeah, interesting. The Symbolic Life is a massive volume. It's the largest volume in the Bollingen series, and this is Collected Works Volume 18. There's an awful lot of good material in there that covers bits that the other volumes cover that have been blended together. There's also the famous Tavistock lectures in here that he gave in 1935, I think that was, in London at the Tavistock Clinic, which has now become somewhat, I won't say, I was going to say notorious, but I won't say that. The Tavistock, for some people, has become notorious for being involved in things it shouldn't be involved in, shall we say. Some of those free letter agencies and other things like that. But anyway, he gave it at the Tavistock, and he covers again the word association test and theory of complexes and many other things. So this is a worthwhile volume. This covers broadly Jung's career, and this is the preamble to Jung's career. So those two are both interesting in that sense.
You said that 16 was your favourite.
Yes.
I think 18 is my favourite.
Is your favourite? Yeah.
I'm not quite sure why. You can open it to anything and it's like, oh, there's something nice.
Oh yeah,
there.
there's something great there. There's no doubt about that. A lot of Jung's books are like that. I think if you open them, you'll find something engaging. And that's entertaining, it's informative, and it's dangerous. Because if you land on something which is inductive for you at the moment, and it seeps into your fracture line on the plate of your personality, you might find that opens just a little bit more. And it doesn't take much further before that crack widens completely. So you have to go into Jung with a relatively stable psyche, I'm afraid, to benefit from it, and certainly to use that to help anybody else. So a number of these internet gurus and manner personalities and entrepreneurs who are pseudo into Jung and have a very limited understanding of him and are inflated by what they do know are dangerous, because they carry information that they can't contain or express properly in their own life and then prescribe that for other people.
Yes.
An example would be many people are pushing Aion out there, not just that chap from Toronto. Other people are pushing it as well, and they're not necessarily very balanced or sane. And when it then comes to articulating those religious ideas in there, you can get yourself into a mess. Always, if you consider letting anybody influence you, look at their context as much as you possibly can.
Yes.
Are they stable? Don't go to someone who lacks stability in order to find stability in yourself. You won't do it.
Oftentimes, if someone's not stable as well, they'll tell you. There's like things want to come out of them. There are so many copycat Aion series that popped up. Not that it's copyright to myself or to Uberboy or anything like that, but it's people. It propagated. And, some of them. And I can't say all of them, but it's like you look at the person. It's that reverse engineer the personal myth, because some of them do admit things about themselves very quickly.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, explains why you might be interested. But then that's the same thing with myself, and it would be the same thing with Uberboy. He won't mind me saying that in this context.
So it's impossible to do this. I'm going to set a benchmark that I fail to achieve myself, but I try. I try consciously. It's a model. And it comes from Tantrism, or the particular school of Tantrism that I was exposed to when I was younger, and I've tried to keep that in mind. And the idea is to be as clear a pane of glass as you can be, in order to transmit knowledge that comes from outside of you, and that could be from past generations, or it could be from another world, if you like. But if you have any shade in you, you will obscure the transmission of that light and will cast a shadow. If you're aware of that, and you communicate to the person you're trying to help, this is an issue I have, this is an area of unconsciousness, this is an area of imperfection I have, you will not harm them, or at least reduce the harm. But if you act as if you are a clear pane of glass when you are not, then you will cast a shadow. That means the transmission of that knowledge from the past, or from another dimension, or however you want to call it, will not be passed properly, because you will be casting the shadow of your own personality on other people. So if you follow somebody who is seriously depressed and gloomy and dismal and goes on about death and dying and chasms all the time, you are allowing yourself to be influenced by someone who might be charismatic, like the Pied Piper. And where will you go? like a lemming over the edge of the cliff and into the abyss, just as he prophesied perhaps for himself or herself. So be careful who you follow. Say how much light is coming through this person and how much darkness. What do you want to fall on you, light or shade? It's up to you. You have to make a conscious choice, a discriminative choice. If you do that, if you can do that, your own psyche will rally. Your own psyche will say, great, you've not followed that particular person, you've not made that mistake, I have to fall back on my own resources.
Yeah.
That's really liberating. Do not attach yourself to gurus. Just like with the best father will set you free. The worst father will contain you. The same with the best mother will set you free. The worst mother will contain you. Yeah. And that mother-father primary relationship you will encounter with every influence you subsequently meet in your life. So you have to be careful. Now, the thing about Jung that is really liberating, so long as you appreciate him across the whole bandwidth, is that he does not hide what he is. He doesn't hide the fact that this is his personal myth. He doesn't hide it. People ignore that because they have other needs that need to be satisfied for them, so they shape the Jung that they want to interact with, and that produces the effect accordingly. But he doesn't hide it. He doesn't hide it. It's clear in psychological types and the reason why he invented his type theory. It's clear in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He says this is my personal myth. He's quite clear in his analysis of Freud and Adler's theories within the collected works that for him, and this is following Nietzsche, when Nietzsche said that every school of philosophy is the creation or reflection of the personality of its founder, he repeats that, not always with acknowledgements in Nietzsche, by the way, but he repeats it and says that all psychological theories are personal statements of the founders. Now, if you miss that, and if you miss the fact that why he created his typology, which is proliferated into nonsense all over the internet, with all sorts of stupid people pushing nonsensical, daft ideas, harmful ideas out there. If you miss it in that, and you miss it in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, you've missed the whole point of everything that he's done. Yeah. It's his personal myth. And when it comes to the Red Book and the Black Book and all the other stuff that he did not, black books that he did not want publishing, and that his son did not want publishing, what you have in effect are the personal, private, medical, psychiatric notes.
It's disgusting, actually.
It is disgusting, of a person who wanted his attempt at self-cure to be kept private, and it's being distributed out across the world to people who don't understand the context from which it originated by at least some people who are making an awful lot of money out of it, and you have to wonder whether that's not one of their primary motives. I would say treat it with respect and turn your back on it, frankly. What he wanted you to know is in the collected works, is in Man and His Symbols and his Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and that is his personal statement that he wanted you to see. His personal issues he didn't want anyone to see are in the Red Book and the Black Books. As for the rest of it, his counsel was know yourself, basically. Work on yourself, which is what he meant by individuation. You have to do that for yourself, and when you come out the other end of that process, however long it may take, and let's face it, it takes a lifetime, because you don't finish until you die, at whatever level you're at the point of death is as much as you've achieved, then that's you, that's yours, it's personal. Don't copy or try to copy Carl Jung, you will fail.
Just to come back to psychiatric units for a moment, Steve. Do you remember that conversation you had with the Chinese gentleman?
Oh God, that was
yes, but
that was a lesson for me.
Yes, it's a serious point, really.
Very
isn't
serious.
It? Because you thought he was a psychiatrist, didn't you?
I did,
and he was completely and utterly versed in Jung. And you sat and had a conversation.
I went to the local psychiatric hospital where I was going to waiting for Pauline. We're going to pick Pauline up from there.
Thank you.
Where she was working as a manager, working with frontline with psychiatric patients. And I sat down there, and then this Chinese. And remember, I had a lot of exposure to Chinese culture, so I was primed to receive this openly, so my defences were down. So this Chinese guy comes along and he's smiling all over his face, sat down next to me and said he was a psychiatrist, junior psychiatrist, but he was a psychiatrist working there.
It wouldn't have been unusual, would it?
No, it wouldn't have been unusual at all. But what happened next was so unusual, it further destabilised me. That he takes out a copy of Man and His Symbols. Sorry, of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And he says, I'm a Jungian. Oh, are you? I'm interested in Jung, and I'm really interested in Chinese culture, and I'm chatting away to him animatedly thinking, how wonderful is this? And then the hand comes on his shoulder, and then the hand comes on his other shoulder. Yes. They'd come back to the ward.
Yeah.
The guy was an inmate.
Yeah.
And he'd been sectioned because he was spouting Carl Jung.
Yes.
And he developed a cultural psychosis. That was a huge lesson to me.
Yeah.
Because it was as if it was deliberately targeted.
It would be.
Yes,
wouldn't
it was like a designer input.
It's like a
wasn't it?
designer input to say, reassess everything you're thinking about yourself, about what you know, about everything. Just reassess it, because you're that far away from going mad yourself if you're not careful.
Oh, yeah.
And I've never forgotten, and you've never forgotten.
No,
it.
I haven't.
It's like, what the heck? That was so Jungian in a synchronistic sense, and so individually meaningful in the way that those different elements all coalesced. I mean, why did he pick on me?
Yeah.
But he did.
But there's a warning in there.
There's a warning in there. Yeah. You have to be careful.
I want to say one final thing on the Red Book when you're saying that. So it reminds me of myself when I was in that the Aion Red Book, Mysterium, Alchemy, Opposites, everything else kind of stage. And it reminds me of myself, but this does apply to everybody else. The level of vanity that it would take for you to think that the answers you're looking for, of which you have no idea what you're looking for, it's just the answers, happens to be in not just the Red Book, but now 3 or 4, isn't it? Beautiful volumes that are incredibly expensive of the Black Books, which are being described, by the way, as the shadow to the Red Book.
Of course.
It's fantastic.
Of course.
So it's saying, okay, so you've read all the rest of Jung's writings, the things he wanted you to see, you've completely understood them, and now you have permission from the man himself to go and look into truly what he was using to cure himself. It's like the absolute level of... And I was there. Yeah. The level of vanity is staggering for someone to do that.
Yeah.
It's like, again, 99.9999999% of people who are doing that and interested in the Red Book have maybe read, one book of Carl Jung? 2, 3, and not understood it whatsoever.
Including Aion.
Yes.
They jump in there, don't they?
Yeah.
Yes.
Volume 9, Part 2, which is really the 10th volume of the Bollingham series. What about the first 9? Do you understand them? It's just ridiculous, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And, if you understand Jung, you know what you must do? Set him aside. You heard the expression, if you meet Buddha on the road, kill him? Do you know what that really means? It's the same as separating from your father once you've been confirmed. And that's what you should do with this. Otherwise, you do no service to this man at all, or of his life's achievements, at balancing himself in the face of terrible, terrible stress that he was under. Yeah. Immensely creative. There's so much that's positive about Carl Jung. But if you remain attached to him, isn't it said too that if you forever remain the pupil of a teacher, you repay him poorly? Wasn't it Aristotle who said that? So the best way to deal with Carl Jung is to study him as much as you can, objectively, within his proper context, and then set him aside with good grace and respect and move on. It's what he would have wanted. Yeah. That's Jung to live by.
I like that. The Personal Myth Ultimate Handbook is now available for pre-order, for release on January 7th, 2021. For anyone who has a yearning deep in their very genome to become who they truly feel they should be, this guide is utterly indispensable. Pick up your copy today and make 2021 the year you truly begin to become yourself.